My name is Michael Cowan. I am on the state board for the Georgia Native Plant Society and also a member of the education committee for the North Metro chapter. And the North Metro chapter is what is bringing you or sponsoring this webinar tonight. So it is the fourth installment in our seasonal explorations of native plants in the Piedmont series with Dr. John Storm, who is the professor of biology at South Carolina Upstate. So this is Dr. Storm.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. As Michael said, I am located in South Carolina, but I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff that I think you've been seeing right around this time of year as well. So we're going to go into things you'd be finding here in the springtime, kind of continuing with our theme that we've done over the past year, really, and looking at what's going on out in nature at this time of year and things that you can do to help nature, like providing nectar source plants, providing food for caterpillars, and more. So, for this presentation, looking at what's going on in the spring, we'll be going into pollen. I've heard on the news a bit that you've had a lot of pollen there in Georgia this year, so this is probably something you're pretty familiar with. So we'll talk about that a bit. And we'll talk about some of the native plants that you'd be finding out there in the woods, or you might have in yards right now, blooming or getting ready to start producing fruits. We'll talk about some of the other things you might find on your trees, like woolly sower galls right here that are pretty common on the white oak trees. And then we'll end looking at some other things that maybe we could talk about in the future. So, uh, many of you may have seen sidewalks or driveways or roads that kind of look like this, and maybe even more yellow here right now or in the recent past. And it almost kind of looks like, with all of the pollen that's been going through the air, like it might make a nice horror movie for some people's perspective. I call it the pollening, is my sort of pollen horror movie, as it sort of seems some years. There was one year where I forgot to close the windows in my house on the big night that the pine trees dropped a lot of pollen, and I had pollen all over around the inside of my house. So that was sort of my version of the pollening. The starring actors in this movie, I guess, would be the oaks and the pines. And it would definitely, for some people's perspective at least, probably seem kind of like a horror movie. And you may be starting to get over that horror movie of all of the pollen right now, but it's still out there, just maybe not as abundant as it was recently. So, what is the purpose of all of this pollen that we've got coming from tag alders or from oak trees or pine trees this time of year? And why do they produce so much of it? So, why does this tag alder, like I'll show you here, produce so much pollen from all of those flowers? Well, part of the reason is that certain trees, like pine trees in particular, they are wind pollinated. They don't have pollinators that visit them at a large amount and deliver that pollen to the female flowers. They're reliant on producing a lot of it with hopes that enough of that gets to a female flower to lead to some seeds being produced, some fruits being produced from that rare chance of pollen landing on a female flower. So we're going to talk about that in regards to the oak trees. And there's a bit of a difference with how this life cycle will go with the oaks. You may be familiar with this in terms of what red oaks do as a sort of life history pattern or pattern of how they develop versus what the white oaks do. In terms of the red oaks, these are the ones that have bristly tips on their leaves, so a bit pointier generally. And then they've got these little bristles on the end most of the time. And their acorns, the process of developing those fruits is also different. They develop them over a 2 year time period, unlike the white oaks, where they don't have those bristle tips. They tend to be more of a lobe that's rounded, not as sharp of an edge, and their acorns mature over just 1 year. So, what you'll see on an oak tree in terms of oak maturation and more really depends on which of these two groups that they fall into. So we're going to talk about that in the case of one of our red oaks, which is the water oak, a very common tree to find in yards, parking lots around neighborhoods, but also off into wild spaces as well. And if you're looking at the water oaks, or really any oak this time of year, you've probably seen lots of these dangling clusters. Some people, I think that that's like the pollen itself, but these are just clusters of lots of flowers with these structures called anthers that hold that pollen, and then they're going to release that pollen. So if we look at just one of those branches up close on something like a water oak here, that cluster of catkins is right here. Many of those male flowers in these long dangling clusters, and those are what produce your pollen. So if we blow those up to be a bit bigger, here you can see those catkins. And then if we look at them even closer, there are those individual male flowers with their bulbous ends here called the anther. That's where that pollen is produced. That's where the pollen gets released from, and then it blows off in the breeze, hopefully landing on a female flower from that oak tree's perspective. Here are some other ones that have not matured and opened yet. And then if you look really close, you can see some little speckly dots around those catkins here. And that is some of the pollen that has fallen down from other catkins right there. So the way this process works is pollen is released from those anthers, and off goes that pollen drifting through the air, slowly drifting around. A good way to see that really well, if you want, is go out at night with like a headlamp on your head, and off in the beam of your headlamp, you'll see this stuff drifting around, kind of like snow coming into your headlights on a car. But it's not snow, that's pollen drifting around in the air, and many, many millions of those pollen grains released from something like a water oak tree. Each of them is very, very tiny. These are some pollen grains right here of water oak, magnified probably right around 500 or so times. They are very small grains. You can't really see the structure to this level of detail with the naked eye, but that's roughly what many of them would look like from a microscopic image that I took with them under 400 times magnification and then blown up a little bit more right here. So that's our pollen grains released by the millions from these trees. And what that pollen grain does is it's going to blow off and land on something like a female flower for some of those pollen grains. So I've got a first year female flower on a water oak right here. There's the female flower right there. They are very tiny. You wouldn't notice them walking by the tree. The only way to really see them is to purposefully look for them. They're only a couple of millimeters or so in size, and you have to look down here at the base of those leaves just as they're starting to come out of the branch. If you look really close there with the magnifying glass, you'll see structures that look like this. Those are those female flowers. So they have these recurved or curving back reproductive structures right here with this sticky tip called the stigma, and that's what is going to receive that pollen. So we can see that happening right here with certain pollen grains sticking right on to that female flower. There's one, for instance, there's another one, and so forth, receiving those pollen grains. And that means that this female flower might develop into a acorn next year as a mature acorn in the fall of 2026 for this particular flower. But you can see last year's acorns on those trees as well right now for the red oaks. Not on the white oaks, really. They've dropped most of their acorns, but on the red oaks, if you look a bit further back onto last year's growth, so more far down the branch than the really greenish new growth this year, you'll see these structures coming off right here, pretty small, just a few millimeters or so in size, maybe 4 or 5 millimeters in size. And those are last year's female flowers starting to develop into acorns, but they're still really small. Much of their growth is going to happen in their second year. And it's in that second year that they go from what was a female flower the prior year to now the 1 year old acorn from that female flower to then this year, over the process of the spring and the summer, turning into that mature 2 year, roughly old, about 20 months old or so, water oak acorn. And that's what you'll have fall off the trees in autumn of their second year, are those acorns, taking 2 years to develop in the red oaks like the water oak. So, and you can see this on any of our oak trees right now. They're all very similar as well. So the female flower that I'm showing you here on the water oak, for all intents and purposes, looks just like the ones you would find on any of our other oak trees. They are very similar. They're very small. Look at the bases of those leaves, and that's pretty much what they all look like. Now, something else you might be seeing right now, if you're out walking around in the woods along a stream, or maybe even in your backyard if you're lucky, are these white and pink clusters of really large flowers. Uh, if you looked at these out in the woods, you might figure it's somebody's escaped ornamental that got off into the woods and now it's spreading down the creek. But you'd actually be wrong. That's not some Asian azalea tree or something like that. This is actually one of our native azalea bushes. This is the pinkster flower, or pinkster azalea, as it's also called. Uh, Not particularly common, but if you look in the right habitat, right time of year, they're pretty distinctive with those white and pink flowers. And they have beautiful, large flowers on them right about now. So look along stream banks, and that's where you'll find them. They've got lots of pollinators that come to visit them as well. So if you go out there, you'll find flies and bees visiting them. But you can also find eastern tiger swallowtails, ruby-throated hummingbirds visiting those flowers. So several different organisms go and use this as a nectar source, as a pollen source, to carry on their next generation as well, distributing that pollen to other pinkster flowers. So if we look up really close at a pinkster flower, you can see these anthers right here. There's 5 of them on this flower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, just like we saw on those oak tree flowers. That's the male structure that produces the pollen, and that's going to get dusted on to a bee or a ruby-throated hummingbird as they come to look for nectar or pollen on these flowers. Then we've got the sticky end right here, the stigma, that's going to hopefully, from the flower's perspective here, catch some of the pollen from other pinkster flower azalea bushes, and then that'll end up fertilizing the plant, and then it'll produce its fruits from that cross pollination of getting the pollen from a different bush onto its sticky stigma right there and producing fruits. So if you watch these bushes this time of year, it looks something like this right here with lots of different bees visiting them. And this bee's mostly going down there after that pollen. You can see how it's gathering some pollen down there in its pollen baskets. And so that's a common sight to see on our native pinkster flower or pinkster azalea this time of year. So beautiful flowers. So you always want to make sure you know what you're cutting down before you start to take out what you think are invasives in the woods. It'd be very easy to think that this was some sort of Asian azalea that got off into your woods, but check the identification first. This one's actually supposed to be there. It's native, even though many people would assume it's probably something from Asia. Now, if you're looking at oak trees, maybe looking for those female flowers or looking at those young acorns that were produced last year on a red oak, you might notice these little golf ball size white clumps on some of the leaves. Oftentimes they'll be a little reddish. They might have little red spots on them, like that right there. And you might wonder, well, what in the heck is this interesting thing? And this is what we call a wool sower gall. So if you find galls, they're very common on oak trees on the leaves, and they're generally made by wasps or mites. And in the case of this one, there is a wasp that does it. This wasp right here, Caliritis seminator. It doesn't really have a common name that we give it, but this is a wasp that ends up producing this structure right here on white oak trees, native here to the eastern US. So some of the ones to look for are eastern white oaks or the swamp white oaks. They have these galls pretty routinely. So if we look inside of that gall, what are we going to find? Well, if you rip one of them open sometime, you're going to see these sort of seedy structures deep inside of that gall. But they aren't seeds. This isn't producing a fruit here with seeds inside. Those are the pupae of the wasp, which have their larvae inside of it, developing into the next generation of wasps. So if we blow that up a little bit more, you can see those little seed-like pupal cases even better. There's several of them here, kind of with this light yellow appearance. And each of those potentially is going to develop into one of our next generation of wasps, which look like this guy right here. This one was not living, I think, when it was photographed, but they're a pretty small wasp that ends up producing these wool sower galls. So what'll end up happening is this next generation of wasps will lay eggs onto those leaves in the early spring, and that's going to develop into this wool sower gall as these hormones from the laying of those eggs leads to this growth of this gall tissue and the production of these pupae, and eventually the next generation here of these wool sower galls that grow up on our white oak trees pretty commonly. I've probably seen, I don't know, 20 or so of them already this year. They're really pretty common to find if you go out and look here in early spring. Now, let's say you're starting to plant some of those great native plants you're going to buy at your plant sale coming up here soon, and you're digging through your mulch, creating some little holes to put your plants in the ground, and you come across a snake. This snake right here, the eastern worm snake. Now, some of you might be, you're not so keen on snakes. They're not your favorite organism to encounter when you're out there working in the flower bed, but there's nothing to be afraid of. This snake isn't going to hurt you. They are completely harmless. You can pick them up and they might poke you a little bit, but that's not coming from fangs. They're not trying to hurt you. They have this little spiny edge to their tail that they use to kind of tap on your hand if you grab them. But it's not going to do you any harm. It doesn't hurt really. It just sort of tickles and feels weird. But that's one of their ways to try to get you to let them go, is to tap you with that spiny tip to their tail. But there's no venom to them. They are completely harmless here. Not going to do you any sort of bad things here. So why are you finding this eastern worm snake under leaf litter? Why is it called a worm snake? Well, that describes what they eat a lot of. It also describes how they live and what they kind of look like. These eastern worm snakes have a light pink belly and then sort of a brownish gray top surface to their body. But they sort of look like a worm as well, live in wormy types of habitats under the leaf litter, within the leaf litter, and then also down in the ground, kind of like a worm. So it's a very suitable name with the habitat that they live in as well. But it also describes what they eat. A lot of their diet is earthworms. down there in the soil, in the leaf litter. And sometimes you find one of these guys and you might think it's a really big worm at first, but it's just a eastern worm snake. They get up to about 12 inches or so long. Just let them go. They'll scurry off on their little way when you come into their habitat there, pulling apart the leaf litter, but nothing to be afraid of. A friendly snake just doing its thing out there in your leaf litter. Another plant you might have this growing in your yard. You might find it off in the woods on a hike this time of year, and that is the little brown jug. So these are an evergreen plant. They're green year round, and so you can spot them pretty well in the leaf litter before things start to green up. And then when you come back this time of year and pull back that leaf litter just a little bit, start to pull it away gently from the base of those flowers, you'll start to see their flowers developing right about now. So they've got some interesting features to the little brown jug. For one thing, in their roots, they have sort of a root beer smell from having the safrole chemical, similar to sassafras. So that gives it a unique smell to its roots. But also, you can get kind of a ginger smell to them as well. So some people call this plant ginger root from that gingery smell. It's got multiple common names for it. So if you do peel back that leaf litter ever so gently and look at the base of the plant right down there on the soil, you'll see their flowers, and they're starting to reach their maturity right now. They're not the most colorful flowers, but they are unique looking. They're very kind of interesting and different from what you might expect as a flower. Part of that is because they don't produce any petals. All of the structure that you see right here, and this sort of looks like something from a movie maybe here, uh, it's just the sepals, these structures underneath the petals on this plant. So, sort of these thick, leathery-ish sepals that have led to another one of its common names called little pig, because it kind of looks like the head of a pig there in side profile. So, little pig is another name that some people use for little brown jug, also named after the structure that this flower kind of looks like, a little brown jug. So, appropriate naming of this plant. So, what does this little pig let in if it's looking to be pollinated? Well, it lets in lots of little small invertebrates. That's what we think probably lead to it being pollinated is little invertebrates coming out of the leaf litter that's covering that flower, climbing into that end of the flower, going after pollen and nectar, and then transferring that pollen to other little brown jug plants, cross pollinating them to produce their fruit. So that little brown jug flowering just not where you can easily see it unless you pull back that leaf litter ever so slightly and carefully to look at those flowers in springtime. Now, another one that's a bit easier to see and it's very common as well, even more common than little brown jug, and the flowers are perhaps in your area starting to finish up, or maybe they're still going, is the black cherry tree. This one's really common in woodland edges. You might have it in your yard as well. It's pretty common there also. And it's one of those powerhouse plants that we associate with things like the oaks that really do a lot of benefit for our wildlife. So in the North Atlanta area, I looked it up. There's at least 317 species of moths and butterflies here that, as caterpillars, feed on the foliage of black cherries, or at least other members of the genus Prunus as well. So a very good resource for feeding the food webs of native species. One of those is this moth right here, the small-eyed sphinx, which is a beautiful moth. And their caterpillars are fed by the leaves of the black cherry and other members of the genus Prunus to develop into that moth. So just one of the many beautiful moths you can get in your yard from having black cherry around. So right now it may be starting to flower or in full bloom of flowers, but if you went back about a month ago, it wouldn't be doing that just yet. It'd look more like this, where those flowers are still in their buds or just starting to pop out of their buds. So we've got one of those flower buds right here. About a month ago, here's another one of them right there. And then a little bit later, they start to open up, typically around early March or so. And then you start to see the flower, this inflorescence of flowers, this cluster of flowers starting to develop here as that bud opens up. So you're seeing here what are going to be those flower buds right there and so forth, just starting to make their appearance. And so as that continues to grow out, to open up, eventually in early March, we get to mid-March and it's starting to get a bit more open. And now we can see those flower buds even better as these little green balls right there and there and there as the many buds on this inflorescence uh, of the black cherry. Inflorescence basically just being a big spike full of flowers. By mid-March, that's starting to open up even more. There's all of our little flower buds that are going to become the white flowers. And then starting to spread out where those flowers are going to be along that inflorescence. Even further, you can almost see they're starting to going to have their flower petals showing up here soon. And there you start to see a bit of uh, that white petal showing up there by early April. Also, a lot of pollen starting to show up from other plants, not quite the black cherry yet, but other plants here on those beautiful leaves. And then typically around late March or so, that's when the black cherry starts to come into flower. Beautiful white flowers with all of these little uh, bulbous ends here, the anthers that are going to produce the pollen of the black cherry tree. So that's going to fertilize some of the eggs of other black cherry trees, typically, sometimes themselves as well if they self pollinate, but ideally other black cherry trees. And then eventually that spike opens up all the way into that inflorescence of white black cherry flowers that get visited by lots of bees and other pollinators. And then their time is done. And once that happens here in April, we start to develop the fruits if that flower has been fertilized by the pollen of other black cherry trees. So if it got visited by bees with pollen on it, you start to develop your fruits. And so we've got those showing up here as these sort of green balls developing into those immature fruits. And they start to develop even more. You can see the remains right here of those anthers that were producing the pollen before on those flowers. Now they're getting those big fruits to develop that are going to turn into the fruits of the black cherry. These little brown, sort of a little bit, they're bigger than a BB, but not very large, black cherries. Some of you may have made jam from them or something like that. It is a bit laborious to do that. They have a very large pit relative to the size of the fruit, but they are edible and they can be used to make things like jams. Typically around mid-June or so, those start to come into maturity as the black cherry fruit. So, something else you're going to be hearing here in the coming weeks. We're not quite to that stage yet, but very soon, here in just a few weeks, you'll start to hear our most common tree frog, and that's the Cope's gray tree frog. There's one of them right here hanging out on the tree trunk that I photographed. They blend in really well, so you can walk past a tree and not even know that they're there, probably, because they have such good camouflage there. So they have this uh, this texture and this coloration that really well match the lichens growing on rocks, lichens growing on trees, and things like that. Where you're probably going to know you've got the Cope's gray tree frog around is one of two ways. One of which is that you hear them. The other I'll show you here in just a second. But we're just about to that time where they're going to start singing loudly in yards from the treetops. And they sound a bit like this that hopefully you hear. So that is the Cope's gray tree frog. So that's the easiest way to know that you've got them around, typically calling from the treetops. And if you have a pool in your backyard or your neighbors or somebody like that might have a pool, that's where they can be particularly abundant. They're oftentimes found around people's pools. But you can also find them around the garden. Here's a young one I found a few years ago on a passion flower leaf in my garden, just hanging out, easily missed. It was quite small, but if you keep your eyes open, you never know what you might find with Cope's gray tree frogs just hanging out on top of a leaf. So if you don't hear them, the other way you'll probably find these frogs is on a window. So walking by a window, particularly if you have lights on in the house or maybe a door, a glass front door, you might see Cope's gray tree frogs like this stuck to the glass, waiting for insects to come up to your windows from the lights inside the house. And then they're going to walk across your window or your glass door and eat those insects coming up towards the light. That's probably how people most easily recognize them. Now, if you look closely here, you'll see these yellowish legs right there. And as you might guess, that's a way to kind of help them stay alive by spooking a predator. That orange coloration doesn't advertise any sort of toxicity to the frog, but it's likely something that spooks a predator chasing after them to see that bright orange on the hind legs as they jump away and think, ooh, that's kind of bright. Maybe they're toxic. Maybe I shouldn't eat that frog. Maybe I'll just kind of let him hop away and I'll go on and find something else to eat. So that warning coloration there to scare a predator, to startle them, is likely the adaptive function of that sort of yellowish orange to the underside of their legs that you see really well on a window. So, something that you might also be noticing this time of year is lots of non-native ornamental plants that people have planted in their yards that you might see in an arboretum. These are some bushes that we've got around some HVAC units on campus here, these Chinese fringe flower bushes. As the name would suggest, they are not native to here. There are some nice native bushes that they could have planted there, I guess. So perhaps it sort of makes you want to do your rendition of Edvard Munch's Scream when you see them planting the non-native ones there. But finding those is a very common thing to see around horticultural areas. And so that may leave you wondering, why is it, if we've got these great plants that we could put into yards just living off in the woods like pinkster flower, the pinkster azalea, why didn't they become common? Why is it so much that we've got plants from Asia or from Europe or Africa in our yards? Why not more from North America? So these numbers here come from this book right here, The Global Migrations of Ornamental Plants, a pretty recent book that tabulated them up for what is sold as horticultural plants in North America. And surprise, surprise, the most common source of what we plant in yards is from Asia. After that, number two is from Europe, and you have to go to number three for North America to get to what you find for abundance in yards right here in North America. So something I could do down the road for you if you're looking to learn about why this is to sort of dive into the history of why is it that so many plants are from Asia. And there's more than one explanation for why this is. There's lots of different factors that have played a role in that. Also, why did we start having lawns in the first place? Who started this idea of having lawns? What were they used for? What might they have projected to people about your wealth or your power, your ability to control nature? Why did this lawn phenomenon become so common? And then why is it that not just in the US, but in other continents say as in Europe, why did they plant things that weren't from their continent? Why is it that people like Prince Albert planted a giant sequoia tree for Queen Victoria's birthday in 1858? That's that tree showing up right here in the lawn at Osborne House, right there. A giant sequoia tree like you'd find on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevadas out in California, but growing here in England. So why do we do this as humans, both in Europe and then here in the United States as well, planting things that are not from where we are? And of course, back when they started all of this, they didn't know the whole co-adaptation of native plants with pollinators and the caterpillars that can consume them. But it is something that people have noticed for quite some time. For instance, if you were to go back and read the American Gardener's Calendar, which chances are you probably haven't read, but if you were living 250 or so years ago and you were somebody like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, this would have been your number one resource, probably, because this is the book that they went to figure out what they could put in their yards. When should they plant that? When does it grow and develop? How do I rear this plant in my yard? They went to Bernard McMahon's Gardener's Calendar. And he's got an interesting statement in his edition here from 1806, as well as the later editions of it, where he says the following. In Europe, plants are not rejected because they are indigenous. On the contrary, they are cultivated with due care. And yet, here we cultivate many foreign trifles and neglect the profusion of beauties so bountiful and bestowed upon us by the hand of nature. So this is McMahon sort of lamenting that in Europe they've got these ornamental things that they put in their flower gardens and in their yards that are from Europe, from England or France, yet in the United States, it seems we've had so much of this history of planting things from Europe or Asia and not as much from our own continent. And so, why would that be? And there's a whole history of how that got started with plant collectors and all sorts of other things. So, if that's of interest, let me know. This is sort of a new topic I'm diving into and might get involved in some of the adult learning classes that I teach. So, with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have about anything with what you're finding in your yard or hearing at night or anything that is on your mind.
How do you manage to take those stunning pictures? Do you always carry a camera or do you go out and intentionally
Uh,
photograph a plant through every stage of its development?
well, with the ones for every stage of their development, I intentionally do that with the idea of making a series for a social media post or something educational, like a talk like this. So I've got that for things like sweet gum, for the oaks, beech trees, pine trees, things like that. The black cherry. But yeah, I take my digital camera out and know to go every few days, try to get the next stage, take it in a similar manner, and then line all of that up in Photoshop and try to put it all together in some way that seems to work well. But I've always got probably my cell phone on me most of the time, and I can take pictures with that quite a bit too. But generally, I use my digital camera, but not always. The cell phone
Yeah.
actually works better for some things.
Yeah, you at least always have it on you. So another
Yeah.
question is, why do non-native plants tend to be more prolific than the native ones? Shouldn't the native ones be more suited to grow abundantly?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are lots of hypotheses on that. One of which is that with plants, many of them coming from Asia, Asia is very botanically diverse relative to North America. So there's a lot of competition amongst plants there for space, for resources. And so some of them are very good competitors, being able to compete in this very species rich environment that they live in within, say, the mountains of China or whatever. But also, we tend to bring back and we're able to transport the ones that could survive easily, that could travel along a ship in a Wardian case or whatever and survive that transport. So to be able to do that and make it thousands of miles from Asia to Europe, it's got to be a pretty hardy type of species that we are selecting sort of by default here because it can make the travel from Asia to Europe to then be propagated for use in the yard. So if that plant was easily killed by any sort of digging up or anything like that, cutting it, we probably would have never had it as an ornamental plant. It never would have made it to Europe for that use. But there's also been a lot of selection by breeding, crossbreeding between this variety and that variety, or one species and another to create these hybrids uh, that can easily be maintained. It doesn't take a super green thumb to keep alive in your yard. So that factor as well has led to them being really competitive, spreading easily, um, being able to outcompete our plants off there in nature because they were kind of selected in several ways to be strong competitors. But that's a great question. That's certainly something you wonder about, like why is Chinese privet or Japanese stiltgrass so competitive in our woodlands? And there's several factors for that.
And I think in general they lack predators, or they don't have as many
Yeah,
for
that as
sure.
well. Yep, yep.
And
So they
so
may
they
not have
just,
specialized predators, and things can't eat them as well. So that helps them to uh, to have more energy to produce fruits because they're not having their leaves eaten as much. But also, many of them tend to be evergreen or leaf out very early in the spring, keep the leaves on later. So they can shade out some of our natives that are adapted to come out later when nothing should be shading them out yet. But this ornamental that leaves out early, well, it does, and it can shade them out, and then they just aren't able to survive and reproduce.
so we just got another question from Paige. If one wants to convert their yard into a native space beyond removing non-natives, what should they do first?
Huh. Well, I'm not a landscape designer or something like that, so I wouldn't go off of my ideas for how to lay things out. But what I would do is talk to people within your native plant society who maybe have experience looking to do what you are going to hopefully do. Talk to people that you know that could maybe come look at your yard. Maybe they have a business that does this sort of thing with native plants. And then think about, based on the habitat that I have, don't think of plants necessarily and what you want to have as a plant. Think about what do I have as the habitat in terms of sunlight, in terms of the soil pH, the soil type, the amount of water and soil moisture that's going to be there. What could tolerate the habitat that I have, and use that as my guiding point to start looking for plants that can tolerate heavy clay, maybe 3 hours or so a day of sunlight. They can get dry for a few months out of the year because I don't want to be watering them all of the time. And then use resources that you might have with the Georgia Native Plant Society website or with the University of Georgia Extension. North Carolina State has some good websites for native plants where you can search for particular soil types, sunlight levels, dryness, and then use that to figure out what are the plants that I could consider native to my area, and then use that as your starting point.
Yeah, and I'll just say, so I have some history there through my business and then in my own personal yard. And my biggest advice to anybody who says they want to get rid of their lawn is don't bite off more than you can chew. So if you can just reduce the lawn little by little, a little bit every year, and do it is manageable because everything requires maintenance. Native plants require less maintenance once they get growing, um, but you're always, because of the pressure of the other invasives in other yards, you're always going to have to be weeding those out and keeping an eye on the plants themselves. So what I have done over the past several years is I will find an area in my yard where I can reduce the lawn by say 6 inches, or increase the size of a bed 6 inches all the way around. So it adds up over time. And then also you can experiment. So if you go to the plant sale this weekend, a lot of the people who donated those plants are going to be there, and they can talk about where they grow best. So putting the wrong plant in the wrong place, whether it's native or invasive, usually leads to frustration. So if you learn, and that is a lot of the resources on the Native Plant Society webpage can kind of give you some of that information, but it's great. But I would just say it's a noble cause to want to do it, but it's a lot of frustration if you go out there and you try to say get rid of your whole lawn. And the other thing I have found, as much as it costs to keep your lawn looking good and alive, try to kill it. It's the hardest thing to kill, the turf grasses that we have. So, and it does no good to plant stuff if you haven't totally killed that, especially like Bermuda, because it's going to go in there and that's going to be your worst weed that you're going to be fighting. So do what you can manage. That's my advice.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep the vinca that's in my yard under control so my partridge berry can spread, but that vinca, it likes to spread. But I have found, for me, the partridge berry seems to be winning the battle in some areas pretty well. But I do go in there and I pluck out the little bit of vinca that keeps trying to show up. But
Yeah, I think it's so hard because it's very hard to get those roots without digging it all up. All right. So again, thanks again, everybody, for joining, and thank you, Dr. Storm, for this presentation. We'll certainly be back in touch to do
Sounds
something
great.
else. And for everybody else, I hope you can go out and enjoy your native plants that you planted. It really is a joy to walk around and look at them blooming from different times. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.